Welcome to the Black Magic Woman podcast with Mundanara Bayles.
When you look at our mob, everyone thought we were just going to die out, but we haven't.
Probably the most adaptable people on the planet.
It's this emergence of this humanality again that I find so enriching.
Be wise, be wise, be wise. Look at ways to cost save so that at the end of the day, your door's still open.
So welcome to Black Magic Woman podcast. And before we start, just giving listeners a heads up, I actually recorded this next episode with Dr Blaze Kwaymullina at home in my bedroom, not in a studio, as we are, I guess, in self-isolation with COVID-19. So welcome to another episode of Black Magic Woman. I'd like to start this episode by acknowledging the traditional owners of whose land we're gathering on today. And I always talk about following diplomatic traditions and the acknowledgement being a diplomatic protocol. So it's only right that we follow proper protocol. I'm in Brisbane, and on one side of the river we've got the Yuggera people, also pronounced as Jaggera. And on the north side of the river we've got Turrbal people. So here in Brisbane, regardless of what side of the river that you're on, I would say it'd be most respectful to acknowledge both traditional owners, and I'd like to do that. And also acknowledge their elders past and present. And it's absolutely wonderful to live in Brisbane. I live on the south side of the river. But earlier on, I was on Gubbi Gubbi country, which is the Sunshine Coast. With my guest today, I'm pretty sure we'll find out that he's on another country. So in terms of talking about the acknowledgement of country, I've just acknowledged that I'm a visitor here on this country, whereas for non-Aboriginal people that live in this country today, I see the acknowledgement as an invitation for you to be part of the oldest living continuous culture on the planet. It's a diplomatic tradition that dates back tens of thousands of years. And if you live in this country and you call this place home, then why not take on some of those same obligations and responsibilities that our people have done, for tens of thousands of years? Not to see the acknowledgement, I guess, as being politically correct, because political correctness came in yesterday compared to how long I've been here.
That's right.
Blaze, I hear you there. So I just want to let our listeners know that, if you've got the opportunity to participate in our culture and become part of our culture, then the acknowledgement, for me, it would be a step in the right direction. So over to you, my brother. Welcome to my program.
Thank you for having me, and I love the name of the podcast as well.
Too deadly. So, Blaze, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, your mob, where you come from, which country you're on?
Yeah, well, I guess just to follow on from what you were saying, at the moment I'm here in self-isolation in Whadjuk Noongar country, which is in the Perth Swan River region of Western Australia, and I live between Noongar country and the Pilbara region up north where I'm from, but I'm self-isolating with the family down here in Whadjuk Noongar country, where I also spend a lot of time. My name's Blaze Kwaymullina. I'm a Palyku man from the inland Pilbara region, so we just border up on the edge of the Western Desert. That's my grandmother's country. What can I say about myself? I've got a wife. I've got a child that is nearly 2. I've got a baby on the way, which is a bit scary in these COVID-19 times. She gives birth in July, so not that far away.
Yeah.
I've got a younger brother and an older sister, and aunties and uncles, and a big family. Professionally, I was an academic for many years. I'm a historian by trade and a criminologist by trade. Before I moved into cultural heritage, native title, and then into being an entrepreneur, and basically as a family group, as our immediate family group, my brother, my sister, my mum and me, we kind of got into entrepreneurship and started running businesses. So
look there.
That's the 5-minute version of my life. I can give you the 2-hour version if you like, but that's the 5-minute version.
No, well, we want to talk about, I guess, first of all, from being an academic and going into business. So how did you get into being an academic? Like, what was you growing up like? Tell me a little bit more about the younger Blaze.
The younger Blaze was a bit of a troublemaker. I was always labelled as that kid that was a dreamer and would end up kind of doing nothing. I actually had a terrible schooling history, so I actually failed year 7, year 8, year 9, failed year 10, and left in the first term of year 11. And I remember it because I was walked off the school premises by one of the teachers that particularly hated me, and he said, you're going to end up in the park like the rest of your people, is what he told me. I was 16 at the time. I'd never actually had drunk any alcohol at that time, so it was actually a bizarre kind of statement to make, you know. I worked some odd jobs and realised that, like, labour wasn't for me, and then I was fortunate in that we have family who are quite educated and work in the university sector, and they said there's a bridging program called the Aboriginal Orientation Program that UWA, the University of Western Australia, runs, and it takes a year, and it's like a bridging program to get into university, run by the Indigenous Centre. So I did that, and then when I got into university, I actually did very well. And so that was as much a surprise to me as probably to everyone that knew me at the time. But I think a lot of Aboriginal people like that. We don't necessarily do well in that type of schooling that you get in primary and secondary school. But I've seen a lot of Aboriginal people go on to great success in university that were like me, that they failed primary and high school. So that's how I ended up there, mostly because I didn't want to dig trenches out of my job I had prior was digging trenches and holes out of swamplands for the council during the middle of winter. And I'm just not cut out for hard work.
This was the better option.
Yeah, that's right. There's got to be something else to do for a 17-year-old kid turning 18, you know. So that's why I ended up there, you know, more than anything, by accident rather than design.
How's that? So you basically started studying history first?
I did history because there was a unit in the orientation course that was about Aboriginal history. And it was the first time I had really, I mean, you hear stories from family about things, but you don't have the historical context that it was this piece of legislation and it was this policy and it was administrated in this way to these people. And so when I started learning history, the specifics of actually how things had happened with our people, it was very empowering, and I wanted to go on and learn more. And so most of the study I did at university was around that, and then studying other minority groups and the things that they had done, and the history around their struggles. And so that was what interested me.
So people more like power. Like a human rights kind of direction.
Essentially, yeah. You know, populations that have been disempowered in some way and are struggling to realise their kind of hopes and dreams and values in an environment and a structure that is not really designed for that. And so it's fascinating to see that, because obviously that's been our experience as Aboriginal people.
Mm-hmm. And then which way criminology?
Criminology was an extension of that. So my area of expertise is specialisation as a historian was the development of the prison system in Western Australia as it was applied to Aboriginal people. So during the colonial times, that was my area of expertise. And so when I did criminology, I was trying to look at how incarceration through the historical period had translated through to modern incarceration, often in the same towns, with a modern jail side by side with the colonial jail, with the same family names from Aboriginal families popping up in the colonial records. Now you see them on the modern record. And so I was trying to trace that. It was quite horrific, actually, because the linkage is so strong that you're looking at a 100+ year story of incarceration, and we know what that institutionalisation does to any human being, doesn't matter what your colour is. So it was a bit of a depressing area to research, quite frankly.
I could imagine, because in delivering training, there's, population data that I unpack. And I literally talk about, like, even though that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up nearly, it's about 3% of the total population, we are the fastest growing population in the country. We're growing at twice the rate compared to the mainstream Australian population, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 3% is about 780,000. 50% of those are under the age of 25 and 40% of those are under the age of 15. So about a third of our population, about 250,000, are actually enrolled from prep to year 12 in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And what that tells me is that if a third of our population are school children, then we have a lot of young people and not enough adults to go around, right? So about half of our population are under the age of 15.
Yeah.
The other 1.6% of our population, when you look at the incarceration rates in this country, that we are the most incarcerated people on the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
30% of the prison population are Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at all 3% of us and you take 50% away and they're children, then you look at the other 1.6% of the adult population and realise that 30% are in prison.
Mm-hmm.
With the 20% of us that are left, that are trying to navigate not only the Aboriginal world and maintain our obligations and responsibilities to our communities, our family, our culture, and so on, but to also navigate the Western world and uphold and maintain, responsibilities to our employers or to our lecturers, to schools, universities, teachers, whatever. So trying to educate mainstream Australians about some of the challenges in Aboriginal society, especially with the incarceration rates and highlighting statistics around incarceration rates, people are really shocked. And when I break it down, via, in terms of jurisdictions, different jurisdictions. So in WA, right, you've got, is it called fine by default?
Yeah, fine default. So poverty crime, essentially, where you can go to prison because you can't afford to pay fines. I haven't been in touch with the prison stats recently, but the disturbing thing for me in terms of the trends was actually the fastest growing prison rate at one period of time was Aboriginal women. And most of it was, I think half of them are in there in WA for fine default.
Okay, so let me tell you, brother, according to some stats I looked at in 2016, there's been a 248% increase of Aboriginal women in prison.
Yeah, that's right.
Since the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. There was over 330 recommendations handed down back in 1991, and people estimate about 5 recommendations have been implemented.
Yeah.
One of the recommendations that was considered literally urgent to be implemented was to decriminalise public drunkenness.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, when you're talking about colonial times, brother, colonialism hasn't ended.
Yeah.
When we look at the colonial, those laws that are in place that in terms of, being drunk in public and actually being locked up for that. For me, that's our those early colonial days, those laws kind of reflect that. But a lot of people seem to think that colonialism is in the past, right? That it's something that happened and now it's over, it's back there. Where for me, colonialism is still alive and well. You only have to look at the policies like the intervention, which is the colonial mentality that's in full swing. But I go back to these laws in place when it comes to the overrepresentation of our mob in these prison systems and the jails, and just having a look at how each state, what laws impact on blackfellas in each state that are different to the other. So in Queensland, we don't have that default by fine. In the Northern Territory, they've got the mandatory sentencing laws. That's 3 strikes and you're out.
Yeah, we've had that here in WA too.
You've got the 3 strikes, you're out. We don't have that in Queensland. But we're still the only state or territory in Australia that it's still against the law to be drunk in public. It's absolutely ridiculous because like you said, the increase of Aboriginal women in WA being locked up over the unpaid fines. Well, we've obviously got an increase of Aboriginal people in general being in prison because they've been drunk in public, where a non-Aboriginal person probably wouldn't get a second look at walking down the street drunk. You only have to go to the Melbourne, the races, right? You don't see black fellas hanging out. I mean, you don't see coppers outside the races waiting to arrest white fellas staggering home from the races, right?
Look, it's a really complex issue, and there's a whole variety of drivers and reasons around these kind of incarceration statistics. I think that probably the best way to describe the phenomenon from a structural perspective was actually made by the WA Chief Custodial Inspector of Prisons, and in one of his prisons reports, he defined the structural racism in a particular way, which I quite like. And what he said is structural racism in the prison system isn't about any particular individual making a racist decision. It's about that he was inspecting a prison that if it was filled with non-Aboriginal prisoners, they wouldn't have had those conditions. So the only reasons why it had those poor conditions was this phenomenon that it was Aboriginal people in it as the majority of those in that prison. And so what he was saying is that it's a structurally racist outcome, right? So it's not about individuals being racist or that. It's actually about that the system itself is somehow producing a structurally racist outcome. And I think that's the best way to describe it, because it's not about attacking individuals or, people will say, well, show me the racism. And you go, well, it's not about finding the person. It's like, if you have an outcome like we have in Australia where there's just such a hugely disproportionate number of Aboriginal people locked up, and it can't simply be explained away by Aboriginal people committing more crimes, because it's a whole bunch of complexity around where people police and like what you're saying, who they pick up and who they don't, and then sentencing laws and what the laws are and all this type of stuff. But I think we could all agree that you say that would be a structurally racist outcome, and we need to somehow address that. So I like that, because it takes away sometimes the debate around the individual and allows us to talk about tackling a system.
And people then don't. So when I talk about those examples when I deliver training, I use that as an example of systemic racism versus individual acts of racism. So I love the fact that you just literally took the words out of my mouth and basically said that's an example of systemic and structural racism. It's institutionalised racism versus individual acts of racism or casual racism. Because for me and from my experiences, being on the receiving end of racism or discrimination as part of your daily experience in this country, you become desensitised anyways. When people say things to you, for me, brother, I've heard it all so much that it couldn't hurt me anymore. Mm-hmm. You become desensitised to it. That's the individual acts of racism. What gets at the core of us as black fellas in this country and to non-Aboriginal people is that systemic and structural racism. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do is we need to educate, mainstream Australians, because if we don't educate them, they're not going to be part of change. They're not going to support us as allies or advocates or whatever. But it's not the 3% of us in this country that can create change that's needed, right?
That's right. We need everyone. And I think the institutionalisation part is massively underestimated. So we need to take a historical lens with these things. So, if you look at the historical pathway of how this operated is, they used the prison systems as the way to get men off the frontier to get access to Aboriginal women and access to Aboriginal lands. And so that's why you see in the early frontier period quite high incarceration rates of Aboriginal men in particular. Then what happens is the prison stats start to disappear. Aboriginal people start to disappear out of those colonial prison stats around when they move into the reserve and welfare regime. And what happens then is Aboriginal people go out of the prison institution into the welfare institution. So they're on reservations, which were essentially, these reserves were basically sometimes described as kindred institutions of forced confinement, which I quite like that term, because that's what they were. They were another type of prison. You couldn't just leave and go when you wanted to. And there was the person in charge of a reserve was called a superintendent. Guess what? That's what we call the person who's in charge of a prison. Or they were in homes, children's homes, where they were getting re-educated. Then we have, about 1972, the last kind of separate racist legislation is repealed post the 67 referendum. And guess what happens to the prison stats around the early 70s? They start going up, and they've never stopped going up since 1972. So if you stretch back all the way along that line, you can actually see that you've got an institutionalisation cycle of people from really the colonial period in prisons through to welfare institutions and then back into prisons going up to 2020. And then you go, well, what does that do to families when you compound institutionalisation across multiple generations over time? The effect is tremendous. And so then when people say, well, why can't you just do this, or what's the problem? It's like, brother, you need to have a historical lens and think about how your family would be with about 175, 200 years of, consistent institutionalisation, and then talk about how well you might cope, and the tools that you might have to be successful in life,
Exactly, because, brother, we all know once you end up in that system, and that cycle starts, and it's a vicious cycle, right?
It starts, sorry to interrupt for a second, but it actually starts when you're born, because your parents may have been institutionalised.
Definitely.
This is the problem. It's not even about a 17-year-old making a bad decision that gets him locked up.
No.
Their parents have been impacted, and their parents are probably, that's also compounded by poverty and these other opportunities. So people have such a small bandwidth sometimes of choices that they can make,
Of course.
And so people often focus at these kids making bad decisions, and it's like they haven't even been supporting those parents, you know what I mean?
I hear
with the right tools.
I hear, and I love the fact that you said that, it starts in the womb, basically, because I would be the first generation on my mother's side that wasn't forcibly removed. And when I state that in a workshop, in a public setting, people are quite shocked that when we're talking about history, we're talking about in people's living memory, right?
Correct.
So if we don't educate mainstream Australians about it's not the Aboriginal history, right? It's just the Australian history, the true history, our shared history. If we don't start educating them, because obviously, past, previous, and even some current governments have chosen not to educate citizens in this country, So it's like we've been left to kind of clean up the mess. And it feels like for a lot of people that I engage with, it feels like people are really wanting to know. They don't know where to go. They don't know who to ask. So I feel that my job isn't as hard as I thought it would be. To engage with people, to educate people, to share knowledge with people, to share your own experiences and you're growing up with people. People are quite open and blown away with it all. But if they don't support us, I always say to people, if the 97% of the population don't jump on board, what kind of Australia are our kids going to grow up in? So I feel a sense of kind of, I guess, responsibility for us as black fellas. If we do have a platform and we can go out there and talk to non-Aboriginal people and have articulate, intelligent conversations with people, who's going to do it? Are we waiting on teachers? We're going to put all this pressure on teachers to embed Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in the curriculum when yet they didn't grow up with this part of education. So it's kind of like we're putting, I would say it's an unrealistic expectation to put pressure now on teachers and educators to now give it justice, our history and our culture and our way of being and knowing and doing. So I feel that a big part of me now just wants to focus on educators. How do we educate educators? How do we give them knowledge or give them the tools that they can actually do it justice when they've got a course that they're trying to embed that Indigenous perspective in?
Yeah, I think you're right. My wife's a teacher, and I've often feel very empathetic towards teachers because the problem that we have is, and as an educator yourself, you'll be aware of this, is knowledge taught poorly is sometimes worse than knowledge not taught at all, right? And it's a strange contradiction, but it's very true, particularly when you insert that knowledge into a context of power. So you take knowledge, and knowledge isn't neutral. Knowledge is laden by context, by power relationships, by history, by a whole bunch of complex things. It's not neutral. And so if you try and put Indigenous knowledge into the hands of school teachers who aren't supported and it's not done structurally, sometimes that knowledge can actually backfire and actually mean that you can actually increase racism in schools as opposed to creating reconciliation. And my view on all of this is part of the problem is we think too small, and we need to be thinking about how we fund nationally as a national priority the preservation and transmission and education of Indigenous knowledge, or Indigenous knowledges, we should say, because there's many different Indigenous knowledges in this country. And that should be a national priority, not taken out of the hands of Aboriginal people, but done in a way where mob have control over their destiny. I'll give you an example. We're sitting here right now talking digitally. You've got Aboriginal communities all over Australia. Imagine a nationally funded thing where there was ways that mob could come in and record and communicate digitally stories about themselves that then could beam into schools and universities, and even universities and schools globally, and there could be an economy around that Aboriginal people could actually
You just thought of a business idea? Has this idea just come about this podcast or what?
maybe, but look, you could be in a remote community. You could be in a remote community, but you're global. If you've got the internet in a remote community, you are part of the global community. You are not just in a remote community. And that's the thing is people often say, oh, the only business we can build for a remote Aboriginal community is tourism. And it's like, no, have they got an interconnection? And they go, yes. And they go, they can do anything. They're connected to the internet. They're connected to a global market, a global economy, a global knowledge economy, whatever economy they want to develop. And so I think sometimes we think too small, and then we think, oh, the answer is to have some stuff in primary school education, as if, and then we're not going to resource and equip teachers to do that properly, so it doesn't work anyway. But I don't think that would solve it either. It's a much bigger answer to a much bigger question is what I think is needed.
Definitely. So in terms of, like, we started yarning about growing up, and then we started yarning about your younger, days, the younger years. And then we went into university and talked about the different, subjects or courses that you've studied. What are you doing now? What's going on in Blaze's world today?
Well, nowadays I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a business owner, and we were in a situation about 7 years ago where we had a couple of people in the family that are very close to me who had significant health issues, and we needed to get more economy essentially into our family unit in order to help give them a quality of life and access to opportunities, and also to pay for some surgery and some other things. So I had naively at that time, I just quit my 10-year academic job and thought, I'll start a business. How hard could it be? That's what people do, right? No idea what I was doing. Didn't even know what an invoice was. You know what I mean? It was just totally the silliest idea I ever had. Fortunately, it worked out. And that was also coupled with another reason why I got interested in it, which wasn't just like a challenge in our family, but because I worked at university for a long time, a lot of community mob, they would ring me up and say, bro, can you write this grant application? Can you write this community program for us? Can you help write this grant application, program, document, whatever it would be, right? Because I know I could write, So I said, yeah, sure. So I'd always be putting for free pro bono documents together of various sorts for community. And at some point in time, they stopped asking me to write grant applications and started asking me to write business plans. And so I was like, business plan? What the hell's a business plan? So, I looked into it. Oh, okay, it's, I know how to write. That's pretty simple. It's nothing too hard. So I started doing that. And I saw this change in the community where they wanted to get off the cycle of government funding of grants and building up programs and having them disappear, and more into entrepreneurship so that they could use wealth to invest back into the programs that they wanted to run for the mob. So that tickled my fancy as well. And then it seemed like something to get into. So I transitioned in. I set up a couple of micro enterprises to teach myself business. Then I gave some of those micro enterprises away to different family members. I go, here you go, here's a mini business, you want it? And then I got the family together as a group, and we said, what skills do we have? And what businesses do we want to get into, under what values, and what do people want to do or not do? And then as a group, we basically started up a couple of different enterprises. And, a couple of them, the main ones we have is my brother has a coffee business, and I have a waste company. And they've been running for about 7 years now, and they've both running quite successfully.
So the coffee business, it just makes sense, right? Because you know the stats around how much coffee's being drank on a daily basis, but around the world, how's the coffee business going for a black fella are you in the Pilbara or are you in Perth?
The coffee business is based in Perth, and that's mostly from a transport and logistics perspective. Yeah. That's where it's roasted, that's where it's created. We started off in that business. My brother started off in the mining camps. So we had a gold mine that was on our traditional country, and the GM of procurement for that facilities management company that was managing it was a very small little mine. I rang him up because at that time we were trying to sell some bin liners and disposable things. And so God knows why we were doing that. We had no idea what we were doing. So I somehow got hold of this guy's number, and he was the general manager of procurement nationally for this company. This guy's is actually working for an Aboriginal business now. So it's, Mr. Matthew Buckley, if you're out there listening, he used to work for Coda Care, now he's with an Aboriginal business. I rang him up, and I was trying to sell him bin liners for about half an hour, knew everything about these bin liners, this is how good they are, it's how long they last, it's the cheapest, best product you've ever seen, all this kind of stuff. And he was such a lovely man. He listened to me rabbiting on for about half an hour, and he said, look, I have to be honest with you, Blaze. And I'd called him as well, never met me before. He said, I have to be honest with you. I don't give a stuff about bin liners. He said, but I do have a coffee problem. And I said, oh, well, what's your coffee problem? And he goes, coffee sucks, mate. We want to switch to a different brand. Can you do anything in that area? And I said, yes, absolutely we can. And I went and had a yarn with my brother, and I said, hey, I think there's an opportunity to do some coffee stuff, because he's a real coffee connoisseur, and he just loves coffee. And then my brother decided he wanted to take up the opportunity. So that was the founding of the business. And
what's the coffee company called?
It's called Australian Indigenous Coffee.
Australian Indigenous Coffee.
Yeah.
And so what's your brother's name?
Ezekiel Kwaymullina.
Ezekiel.
He's a writer. He's a children's author, very well-published children's author, and a owner of a coffee business.
And how's it going? Like 7 years into it?
It was good. Look, it was slow going probably for the first 4 years, to the point where many times I thought, my brother and I would sit down and have a yarn and be like, should we shut this thing down? Like, what are we doing with this business? Is it ever going to do anything? Because it wasn't paying any bills, and we were kind of just, it was a labour of love because we both love that business so much because we both love coffee, and it's a fantastic business to be in, but it's a difficult, tough business, a very competitive business.
Yes.
Yeah. But eventually it's like a funny thing happens in business. First 2 years you start getting somewhere because people recognise your brand, and then about 4 years you seem to get another level of brand knowledge, and then the last couple of years, year 5 and 6 in particular, it's sort of full on business now. Shipping a lot of coffee nationally, not just in WA, doing offices, mining camps, schools, all sorts of stuff. So. But it's a lot, these businesses, that's the thing. Sometimes you can get lucky and you start a business up and it can go straight away. And that was the waste business. The waste business we set up just went like a rocket from day one, and it's never stopped since. Coffee was a labour of love, and, you felt like we just had to drag it along until now. It's going really well, and it provides my brother and his wife and it supports their family. So sometimes these things take longer than you think to establish themselves.
Of course. And would you say, the Indigenous procurement policies had anything to do with the fact that the businesses are both going okay now? And I'm wondering, obviously, you're Supply Nation certified as well, so it'd be good to hear, as a business owner and your family and business as well, is there any of the current things that are happening right now, like Supply Nation, this IPP, has any of it contributed in your success at the moment, or is it helping you, or is it you haven't really had anything to do with the IPP? Or
I think there's probably two levels to it. First, I would credit our success to, we started this podcast talking about history, and I think that if you're an Aboriginal person running a business and is successful, or you've got a university degree or those types of things, your ability to do those things were bought and paid for by old people who sacrificed for a right they would never experience, right? They couldn't get into university, so they campaigned so other people could get in, and they never saw that sometimes in their lifetime,
Yeah.
So, we're standing on their shoulders, so, that's why I don't like to go, I'm successful because I'm Blaze. I'm successful because that's been bought and paid for, and then the other half of the success is the hard work I put in, but I'm certainly standing on those shoulders, as is my brother. My nana was illiterate, and she was born in a dry creek bed up on the station up north, and she didn't have those opportunities, neither did my grandmother, who's very clever. And she didn't have the opportunity to go on to university her time because that's not what they encourage black women to do. So
they're not going to be nothing but domestics, right?
That's right, and that's what they were. That's what my nana was, So that's the first thing. I would give that credit to that before I would give credit to anything else. Second, I would say that for us, the businesses, we are from the Pilbara, and the Pilbara is really one of the mining capitals of Australia. And there are a lot of strong native title agreements with different industrial players that have procurement impacts in terms of wanting to support Indigenous businesses, Pilbara Aboriginal businesses in the supply chain. So absolutely, that was a driving factor in the Pilbara. Pilbara is about 20 years ahead of anywhere else around these types of things because of native title. So we've had that up for a long time. So Supply Nation and the government stuff back then in the early days really had zero impact on anything. Over here in Western Australia, Supply Nation hasn't been as relevant. That changed when the IPP came out. So early days, it was native title and the rest was just people with wraps, and it kind of just didn't mean anything. Once the federal government brought that Indigenous procurement policy out, and then when that was followed by state governments creating their own Indigenous procurement policy, and we had ours in WA kicked off by the Premier and Minister Wyatt, the Treasurer, first Aboriginal Treasurer, WA, last year, it has created a tremendous change. And so Supply Nation now is important because of the way it interfaces with that state and federal government procurement policy. And I think you've also now seen it's a perfect storm where you're seeing a convergence of best practice. So if you think about it from a big tier one contracting company, a big non-Aboriginal tier one contracting company, in the old days, what would happen is the only time they could ever ask for Indigenous stuff was when they tendered on a mining job. And the miners would say, how many Aboriginal people are you going to employ? Are you going to deal with Aboriginal suppliers? And they'd go around and go, they don't have any policies or procedures for any of this. And so they basically bang something together just for that client. because no one else was asking for them. So when they were doing federal government jobs or state government jobs, they never really asked it for it. So they only really had to make an effort. But that meant that never really changed their systems and processes. They just kind of did a one-off for that tender.
Mm-hmm.
Now what you've got is wherever they go, someone's asking them for it, either because they've got a RAP or because it's a state government procurement policy or because it's a federal government procurement policy. And so now you have a convergence of an informal best practice standard. And these organisations are getting asked for it by enough people. They've gone, well, let's just invest in changing some of our systems and procedures so it's more cost effective and efficient for us to deal with Aboriginal suppliers, because everyone wants it. So if we're going to do it, then let's do it properly and let's be the best at it so it's a competitive advantage. And I think that's the change in mindset that's happened at the big end of town that is now driving like little business like ours and others and yours, that they're now coming to us in a different way because they're more organised to interface with us. You know?
Yeah, I would have...
That makes sense?
Definitely. And that's what... You know what, me and you, I think this is just for listeners now. This is the first time you and I have ever yarned, right?
Yeah. The
first time. And Annie Mary Graham, who is the person behind the name of Black Magic Woman, Annie Mary and I have spent a lot of time on the road together. And after me telling her chapters of my life, you know, going back in the days and growing up in Redfern and the life that I've lived, I come from quite a politically active family with my dad and my grandmother at the forefront. You know, those protests in Canberra in 82, in Brisbane for the Commonwealth Games in 88, in Sydney. So, like, in terms of my life and my upbringing, Annie Mary was one person I just could tell my life without judgment on the road in all these different hotel rooms in the last 7 years. Right, just to give you an idea of the travel Annie Mary and I do. My daughter just turned 3, and as of August last year, she'd done 220 flights.
Wow.
With me and Annie Mary. So I was pregnant, had to keep delivering training. I gave birth and a week later went back to work with the baby. When you're talking about obligations to family, right, I was living and breathing what we teach. Those Aboriginal terms of reference where people have to understand that, you know, we are not individuals, we're part of a group. And our obligations to that group and the family and the whole kind of kinship system comes one, and well, it doesn't just come one, it's our priority. So, you know, that's just giving you an idea of all the travel Annie Mary and I do. There's lots of these plane rides and hotels and in the back of the cars that pick us up where we're just yarning about life, everything but work. It's the best. It's been the best. And these are moments and yarns that I'll remember and cherish forever, right? So yeah, Annie Mary, one night, she said to me, "You got to write a book, Mundanara." She calls me Mara, by the way. She says, "You got to write a book, Mara." And I said, "Oh, Annie Mary, look at our life. Who's got time to sit down and write a book?" And she says, "Well, one day you'll meet someone who'll be able to write the book for you. They'll just sit there with a recorder and you can start telling them your life like you've been telling me." She says, "But I've got the perfect title for your book." And I said, "What is it?" And she reckons to me, "Black Magic Woman." And when she said that to me, you know what? I had a laugh to myself because to me, coming from Aunt Mary, who's a 70-year-old, you know, professor in philosophy and all other stuff.
Genius.
Political
she's
science.
a genius.
You know, for her to sit back and tell me Black Magic Woman, in my mind, I just thought, you know, Annie Mary, that's a T-shirt. That Black Magic Woman, I would buy that. So here it is now, the podcast with Black Magic Woman. But I wanted to say that, you know, I have never met you before, and Annie Mary and I was in Perth about 5-6 years ago, and she said to me, "There's a young brother and sister that I want to try and connect with. They're from over here." And she wrote your names down. And she literally wrote them on a piece of paper to me. And she said, "Have you heard of these people?" I said, "I've never heard of them." I've never been to Perth before. You know, I see the Bungles, but I was in Perth. And so she wrote these names down, and I Googled you fellas, you and your sister. And she ended up telling me the next day, you know, we went to our hotel room, we had to sleep. I woke up and she said to me in the morning, "You wouldn't believe who I was speaking to on the phone last night." I said, "Who?" She said, "Blaze. I found him." So Annie Mary said, "Next time you're in Perth, or if we're here together, we need to go and meet them." And I've only come back once or twice, and you fly in at night time, you deliver the next day, and you fly out that afternoon.
It's hard.
So you've been on the hit list, on the priority list for someone that Auntie Mary wanted to connect me to have a yarn.
Yeah.
And now I know why, in terms of the pathway and the life that you're living. And, I just I thought I was going to help Auntie Mary and Auntie Lilla get their vision out, which was this black card training. And it was their work that they had done, back in the 80s for UQ, while I was, looking after 2 little ones and I was working full time. Next minute I'm working on their business. And now 7 years later, I've ended up in their business. So I a lot of the things that you said about your life and your journey I could resonate with. And I just think it's really important that people that are listening to this podcast actually get to hear who we really are, what's underneath, who we might be or who we're portrayed as, or what's written on the internet or what our LinkedIn profile says. But these yarns here that I want to have with people just talk about who we really are and what we're about and what matters to us. And there's so much that connects us, and there's so many commonalities and similarities that I think mainstream Australians, that haven't engaged with us yet, they're missing out on this.
Well, I agree with you, but I think that also goes in terms of the conversations amongst our own mob, and we've got to really, the importance of being able to agree to disagree and talk through difficult issues, both Aboriginal to non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal to Aboriginal.
Oh, for sure.
It's really important, and because there's a lot of really big discussions to be had amongst our mob at the moment, not just around business, but around sovereignty and treaty and all these other types of things. And everyone's voice needs to be respected and heard, and everyone has a different experience, and a different language and culture and law and all these types of things, but a different experience. And in the business world, we have to be very careful that when we're suggesting changes or we want to be an advocate for fixing a problem, because we all understand there's problems. Like, you could be an Aboriginal business out there doing what you're doing and you're encountering bottlenecks, and so you're trying to seek a solution to that, which is normal. But what we have to understand is that everyone's in a different type of market with a different type of business, with a different type of experience. Some are in regional, some are remote, some are in the city, some are manufacturing, some are service orientated, some are infrastructure, whatever it might be. So the temptation is to judge the problem and the solution by what you're doing. So this is what I've got this business and I'm selling shoes and this is my problem. And so you can suggest something, but then that's not going to fit that person over there that's in large-scale infrastructure, or that person over there that's in a software as a service business. So that's where I think we need some more positive collaborative discussions amongst our mob. We need some better mechanisms to bring people together to have really robust and sensible and productive discussions around what are the structures that are going to better serve our people to facilitate the growth of the Aboriginal economy. Not, I've got a problem and that's why I want this solution, because that might then make it harder for some bloke down the road or some lady who's trying to do a different job, but that model won't now fit. So that's why I'm just a bit of an advocate at the moment, because I think sometimes we're getting a bit of these one view debates, and my view is I don't necessarily have a view. I just want there to be a multi-view discussion.
Exactly, and to know that there are many views, many perspectives, and those different experiences that we all bring to the table. But what platform or where's the opportunity for us to come together, right?
Yeah.
So IBA have that, Strong Women conference. There's other conferences that are out there, but you seen the price of them conferences or what?
Yeah. This is the thing,
Seriously? You talk about taking advantage of the Aboriginal economy here, or the Indigenous, the industry. It's an industry, right?
It is an industry. Yeah.
What is it? Accolade, conferencing mob. They put on that conference in Cairns.
Yeah, I saw that on LinkedIn. They were getting fairly heavily criticised. Look, part of the problem is that this goes back into the problem that we've had in this country since they abolished ATSIC. Now, people have different views of ATSIC, right?
Yeah.
So for those that may not be familiar with that acronym, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, that was around in the 1980s. Now, it was part of the self-determination model. Some people, liked it, some people didn't. Some things, there were bits that worked, some things didn't work, and it was probably a mix of those things. But what it was it was a model. And then when you take away that model, you're just left with a committee that advises the Prime Minister, which is not representative in any way. Even though the old model had issues with it, at least it was a model. And where do we go then as a structure for ourselves, and when that's gone, And they've never had anything truly stick that's replaced it, you know?
No, and when you talk about ATSIC, for people that don't know ATSIC was an experiment in terms of an experiment in democracy, trying to teach black fellas how to be Democrats, and that's not a part of our culture. It's not a part of our way. It's not how we never had a voting system, right?
No.
When you think about our culture and our society, it was consensus decision making. Everyone had to be in agreement, you know, before a decision was made. It wasn't just about, let's take a vote on this. So to have that kind of system enforced on us, and for us to then try and navigate that and participate within that, of course there's going to be problems. It was open for corruption.
Yeah.
In our communities, right? In our communities, we would know who the right people are to represent our mob, and that would do the best thing and would have the mob's best interest at heart.
That's right.
We know who the opportunists are, people that would take advantage of that opportunity. So they wouldn't get voted in by the mob. We wouldn't elect them.
Well, that's right. Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think ATSIC was perfect. But the problem we have is, as a people, is that we've got hundreds of Aboriginal nations, essentially, and we all have our local decision-making models, which is fine. But we need to be able to overlay some structure over the top that allows local people to make local decisions and feed into a national system in some sense that advocates and lobbies on behalf of us all from a policy perspective that we can all mostly agree on. And there's lots of models that you can do that. There's lots of models overseas with native Canadians, and you know there's you know, Maoris have done some interesting stuff. There's some interesting stuff in America. So it's not like that. I mean, people were talking about this stuff in the 80s and the 90s. This is old stuff, and it's existed for donkey's years. But it just requires some political will and agreement to, I think. But if you're having those things, yeah. Otherwise, what we're left with, right? What we're left with and what we're driven to is the individual capitalist, right? Okay, so we're driven to individualism because that's what the system supports. The system that we operate in is a Western knowledge system, which is set up in a way as a capitalistic basis, which will reward you for being engaging in pursuits as an individual. Mm-hmm. And as you know, we come from a system that is much more, you know, group orientated, right? Mm-hmm. So if we don't manage to create structures, and either if we don't have to wait around for the government to do it. We just, you know, people just can create their own, and they are creating their own, and there is some good stuff out there. Otherwise, what we're left with, and this is the same, I think, for the Aboriginal business movement, is it'll be the realm of successful individuals. Some individuals will be very successful, and then a bunch of people will miss out because they don't necessarily think that way, and they might need some different supports, and they're also trying to advocate for a different type of economy. So you've got people who could be very successful at community level. You may not be successful in an individual capitalistic economy because that's not their desire, but they're very clever, very successful people, right? Mm-hmm. So that's you know, I think why we need to push the bigger questions and the bigger debates, because otherwise we're left with the people that will kind of do okay, probably would have done okay anyway, and the people that needed a hand won't get that hand, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mate, I think you and I could sit here all night. I'm just sitting here going, you know, I've been talking to my producer today, and I said to him, look, if I get 10-minute yarns, I'll be happy, right? They don't all the 20-minute yarns, right?
I mean, you're yarning with blackfellas. You're not going to get 10-minute podcasts.
No, and I don't want 10-minute podcasts. I want to talk about things that matter to us, right? And if what you've been yarning about are things that I've either experienced or I've got some kind of connection with or whatever, it's just amazing to see that two complete strangers, right? We have never met each other, but we've never had a yarn on the phone either before, which is unbelievable, but to have so much in common, especially with you're in business now, right? And all of these things that you're suggesting around our mob to connect, and we need these platforms, are things that I think about every day. But it's like, for me, I keep thinking, all right, we don't need to wait for government, right? Mm-hmm. There's this, you know, close the gap there. There's $30 billion that's spent each year in the Indigenous affairs industry, and we're not seeing much change, right? Despite Close the Gap and there's seven areas that they're measuring, and five are not on target. Mm-hmm. So in 10 years, despite all the billions of dollars, you only got 2 areas that are on target. For me, that's depressing. So the last thing I want to do is focus on Close the Gap and focus, or just, I don't have any faith in government, right? I think I'm engaging at the moment with philanthropic organisations across the country. And philanthropists only give 5% of their money to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander charities in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And yet a lot of them, are very passionate about education. They're passionate about homelessness. They're passionate about the arts and whatever. And a lot of our mob have businesses in those different industries. So if they knew about us and knew some of the struggles that we were having, that can't get government funding, I'm sure that they'd back us if they knew we existed. So the last 12 months, I've been engaging with a lot of philanthropists and rolling out Black Card's Cultural Capability Program to at least 50 philanthropic organisations in this country. And I tell you now, Auntie Mary blows them away. She blows everyone away. Once they meet Auntie Mary and they sit there and they hear about our culture, how Auntie Mary sums it up, and our way of life and how we've been impacted, but more from a strength-based. Not sitting here talking from a deficit model at all, not one bit. She reminds them that we're owners and runners of country. You just need to remember that we ran an entire country for tens of thousands of years without no outside interference, no outside help. So we're owners and runners of country and we need to be treated accordingly. And when she says that, I just say, boom. People need to remember that we're not hunters and gatherers. We're not all, primitive. We're not all cripples. We're not all victims. We don't all need help. And if we've got that victim mentality, it holds us back. And that's what I love about Auntie Mary when she engages with people, and listening to her makes me feel really deadly that a lot of mainstream Australians and even our own mob are hearing information that they never heard before.
You're totally right. And I'll give you an example of how that plays out as a limitation in the thought process in the business sense. A lot of the policies close the gap, and also even really the Indigenous procurement policy from the federal government and really the state-based procurement policies. They are based on deficit models, right? And essentially, if we adopt the basis of disadvantage as the argument for our economic rights, then the best that we can get is parity. So the best that we can do is close the gap to say that now we're as good as non-Aboriginal people. That shouldn't be the basis of what we're arguing. We should be arguing from a basis of sovereignty, right? Economic rights grounded in being the first people of this country who never ceded their sovereignty. That's what, it's not quite that, but native title right in terms of economic negotiation to get those procurement drivers in is a bit closer to it, because it's not based on disadvantage. It's actually based on a kind of a land right or a sovereign right in some sense, right? So the basis of those policy drivers, even though people say these look the same, so an Indigenous procurement policy, they're all the same. Well, they're not all the same, because some of them are founded on a different philosophical concept. The government ones tend to be based on a deficit close to gap model. The native title ones are based on more of a kind of a land right sovereignty one. And then there's a mix of frameworks in the middle around reconciliation or other drivers which probably borrow from a few different things. But this is why I'm saying the thinking comes in for our mob. We should be saying the basis in which we're here isn't because, hey, I'm begging you for an opportunity in your supply chain. And if you feel really good about lifting Aboriginal people out of poverty, you should give me a contract. That should not what we should be arguing for. That's a byproduct. So that's true, and that should happen, but it's a byproduct, right? Fixing poverty is a byproduct. The primary driver should be, hey, I'm a sovereign person. I come from a sovereign mob, and we have an economic right, and we're exerting our economic right to participate in this economy that we've been historically marginalised on. Because if you think about the compensation piece, all the stolen wages, stolen land, stolen labour, if the best we get out of that is a 3% procurement policy, well, we sold our people down the river if that's where we want to stop. You know what I mean? Because, that's settling for the breadcrumbs instead of having a seat at the table.
Got to remember they got a whole country for nothing, right?
This is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Come on.
Exactly right. So there's a big economic right debate that's been happening since the earliest days of colonisation through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and we shouldn't surrender that debate. So we should say, look, thank you, those procurement policies are great. Yes, there is a deficit that needs to be addressed. Yes, there is a poverty gap and a health gap, and we want to do those things. But those things are part of also a bigger debate around our sovereignty, and we're coming to you from that basis. Because you see it driving some of the discussions that you meet from procurement people. So some procurement people will go, you're an Aboriginal business, we've got a procurement policy, so we want to give you a contract. And others will come to you and go, I want to know what you're doing for the community. And the reason why they ask that is because they're basing it on a social model, on a deficit model. So they know, I want to know what you're doing for the community, because if I give you this contract, then I don't want to know what the flow-on economic impact effect is. The problem is they don't ask that for the non-Aboriginal businesses.
No, they don't. That's exactly it.
And that's why we need to be clear. Hold on a sec. On what basis have you got a procurement policy? Is it a welfare model, or is it a sovereignty model? Because I'm a sovereign person, and I'd actually rather have the sovereign person discussion with you than the welfare discussion, you know. Because I'm going to look after my mob. I'm doing all that. You don't need to worry about that, brother. You know, every Aboriginal business is out there looking after their own family mob. You know, they're all doing it.
You know, we employ our own mob, you know, second to, I get it. Brother, it's so important that you're talking like this, because if we're going to come to the table, then we want to operate on our terms of reference.
Exactly.
We've got to set the table, but I think for far too long, we've had to fit in, we've had to play the game, we've had to educate ourselves, we've had to upskill ourselves, and some of us have been drawn over into that Western world because it's quite seductive and quite comfortable to operate on white terms of reference, right? Sit in that hierarchy, be a boss, treat everyone below you as second best or whatever, right? But for me, right, to be able to consolidate what Aboriginal terms of reference is, what our knowledge systems is, what our ways of building relationships, of engaging or whatever it is, our governance structure. You know, how can we bring that to the table and say, we're going to get better outcomes if we can operate this way?
Look, exactly. I'll give you an example. Why don't native title groups form trade agreements with each other?
Mm-hmm.
A trade agreement is something formed by one sovereign nation to another. So why don't native title groups form trade agreements between each other about how they will pursue economic rights, about activities economically that happen on the country, around how they cross-leverage the businesses that belong to those native title groups, or the families who may have businesses to that group, and all these types of things, how they cross-negotiate with developers or industrial players, all those types of things. You know,
Talk about creating an Aboriginal economy, right? That's what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And maybe if there was a Royal Commission into the native title legislation, because it is the most amended act. It's the most amended piece of legislation in Australia's history, right?
Look, and please don't take it for me to be saying that native title is great. Look, it's flawed, but it's what we have.
That's what we have.
It's what we have.
If we can, like you said, you know, it's like we're reinvigorating another ancient practice, right? It is how we traded and how we did business. When you think about doing business, we've been doing business for tens of thousands of years. It's not a new concept to us.
Absolutely.
And we're blown away when we start learning about the white fella way of, you know, being in business, and maybe based on the individual and whatever. I reckon for a lot of us that we've been able to navigate the Western world, take a bit about how they do things and kind of mix it into how we do things. So at any time, you know, we can operate on their terms if we want to, but we're navigating their world most of the time, but we're navigating our world as well. There's these two lots of kind of knowledge systems that are coming into the play. There's, you know, when I'm engaging with white fellas, I know straight away I'm code switching.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I'm engaging with black fellas, I know exactly, like if I'm with Black Card, right, I'm the managing director and I wear that hat. And when I'm engaging with white fellas, say at the workshop, they see me as a managing director. But as soon as I come out of that workshop setting or Black Card setting, I'm like an apprentice. I'm still serving my apprenticeship under the elders.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm not up here in this hierarchy anymore. I'm back down here. Mm. You know, I'm an equal in my community, especially with other people around my age. I'm not below people. I'm not above people. Mm. So could you imagine taking that kind of these concepts, you know, this knowledge into the corporate sector and maybe just humanising the corporate sector?
Well, why not? I mean, look, the reality is it actually already happens. So if you look at what our systems are about, you know, and how they operate holistically, interconnected networks of relationships that are constantly dynamically shifting and moving and transforming in space and time, right? And you move through that complexity through the governance system, which is essentially kinship, which provides you the roadmap of how you navigate complexity, right? Modern business is actually all about that. It's about the co-creation of value. Economically, we know that if you have the strong relationships, you make money. That things are integrated. If you look at now what's happening with the fourth industrial revolution, which is about integrated sets of big data, all sorts of different aspects, it's not that dissimilar to what Aboriginal people talk about. Mm-hmm. So the irony is sometimes when we're talking about business, we say business to mean, I guess, what we think of business is. And the reality is that there's kind of some old school ways of doing businesses, which are hierarchical pyramids where the boss is a particular way and it's all driven from the top, and then the poor little workers are down the bottom. But then you've also got like these modern businesses where you see a lot in different tech companies, and also just in the way everyone's becoming a bit of a tech company and how they have to modernise and integrate. A lot of this new way of doing business that's coming in, our people should actually have more tools to succeed in, because we already think like that.
Of course, my brother. And I just want to say that I am so looking forward to yarning with you again, and I'm pretty sure you'll be a regular on my show, my brother.
Anytime, yeah. I'm always up for a yarn. I think getting the positive stories out there is really important at the moment.
On that note, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure yarning with you. And
no worries. Thank you.
No worries. Until next time, eh?
All right. I'll catch you later, sis. Have a good one.
Thank you. See you.
See ya.
And that was Dr. Blaze Kwaymullina, an amazing man, a man of many talents. The coffee business with his brother, the family business that he's got with his mother and sister, and just his amazing life. And I can't wait to speak to Blaze again, who will be joining Dr. Mary Graham in an episode in the next few weeks. Join us for our next episode, as I'll be yarning with Leah Cameron, the Principal Solicitor and Managing Director of Murrowa Law, which is Australia's leading independent Indigenous legal firm specialising in commercial and Indigenous law solutions for government, business and traditional owner groups. Until then, bye for now.